Hello, everyone, and welcome to my Week 2 lecture about undoing colonial myths and stereotypes. So, to critically understand Native American society and culture, we first need to unpack the deep seated biases that for so long have distorted Native Americans' lived experience in the minds of many non Native peoples. So, recognizing common misconceptions helps one to gain a more realistic view of Native American history, society, and culture. So, we need to do this unpacking work before we can move on to the next weeks. First, let me define some key terms that can help me unpack these issues. The first is settler colonial ideology. So, we need to do this step by step. First, what is settler colonialism? This is closely related to imperialism and colonialism in general. Settler colonialism is a term used to describe a specific type of colonialism that is based on the occupation and settlement of another society's land, and also the displacement of indigenous peoples from that land. The second term to help us get to the larger term is ideology. So, the term ideology describes a belief system or a system of knowledge that is used to rationalize and justify a particular worldview. Ideologies tend to create biases in the minds of the observer. In other words, ideologies create distorted views of reality. Putting these two terms together, we get settler colonial ideology. So, in this sense, settlers use ideology in the form of stereotypes to justify, rationalize, and legitimate their claims to the land that they have occupied by force. At the same time, these stereotypes are used to justify the dispossession of indigenous peoples whose lands have been occupied. For many of us, the most familiar historical examples of settler colonialism are found in the history of the British Empire and the nation states that developed out of it. For example, the history of the United States, Canada, and Australia have a well known settler colonial relationship to indigenous peoples. Outside of the scope of the British Empire, we also see it in the history of Spanish peoples in Latin Americas, the history of the Portuguese peoples in Brazil, the British and Dutch occupation of South Africa, the French occupation of Algeria, and the Israeli occupation of Palestine. In all of these examples, occupying powers use cultural stereotypes about indigenous groups to justify the occupation of indigenous lands and legitimate the dispossession of indigenous peoples. Moreover, these ideologies usually turn into full blown nationalist myths that tell a triumphant story about the innocent and heroic origins of the occupying nation, while erasing the ongoing presence of the indigenous groups that are still living there. The link to cultural and physical genocide is apparent. Whether through religious conversion or assimilation, through warfare, massacres, or apartheid, the real and symbolic erasure of the indigenous population is deemed integral for settler states to assert ownership over the land. My overview here leads to our two assigned readings for this week. The two readings kind of bookend one another insofar as one discusses the early history and the other discusses the more recent history of settler colonialism in the United States. So, what I'm going to do is summarize the first reading and then add my own lesson to fill the gap between them, and then I'll summarize the second reading. By doing this, you should be able to see a through line about the history of settler colonialism in the United States. The first reading by Heke Paul discussed Christopher Columbus and the myth of discovery. It described how the myth of Europe's so-called discovery of the Americas became the foundational myth of the United States. So after Columbus landed on the Caribbean islands, which he believed were part of South Asia, he described the land as being populated by a native population in need of conversion and salvation. Despite the noted existence of indigenous peoples, Columbus began a tradition of describing the continent as an earthly paradise, an essentially empty landscape full of resources that was open for occupation, exploitation, and the pursuit of profits. His description was distorted in part by his aim to please the Spanish monarchy, who had funded his transatlantic voyage. Columbus's description influenced Europe's mythological vision of the entire North American continent, a mythology that dismissed the history and ongoing presence of Native American societies. This myth of discovery developed and became the foundational myth of the United States. In the 1800s, it was adopted by Euro American settlers in the early United States. It reinforced their religious belief in manifest destiny, which justified the westward expansion of the United States toward the Pacific coast. Later, in the modern period, at the turn of the 20th century, the myth of discovery reinforced Euro American notions of human progress and racialized notions about civilization. As Heke Paul notes in her chapter, the myth continued to shape U.S. policies about citizenship and immigration, and it was also taught in the U.S. education system, which gave it a deep resonance in U.S. culture. I will step in here to add my own lesson. It concerns the temporal displacement of Native American society in U.S. culture. In other words, I will describe how U.S. culture portrayed Native Americans as being frozen in the historical past. By doing so, it excluded Native Americans from the story of modern society. This is specifically a discussion of U.S. culture and its history, but it encapsulates a broader sense of European culture, which is all related. So, this portrayal of Native Americans as being frozen in time had its roots in the Enlightenment era, roughly around the 1700s. At this time, European and Euro American scholars tried to incorporate Native Americans into their knowledge of world history. In doing so, they developed a stereotype that described Native Americans as quote unquote primitive peoples, ignoring the fact that at the time, most Native American societies had agriculture, complex governments, and had long participated in the expanding global economy, and ignoring the fact that tribal nations competed on equal terms with European nations in North America. These scholars developed an idea of civilization that excluded Native Americans. This, in turn, promoted the idea that Native Americans were somehow relics of an earlier period of history. An early conversation in anthropology, which was then known as the science of man, added to this stereotype. Anthropologists used early race theory to describe Native American peoples as quote unquote savages. Altogether, these prejudiced beliefs of the Enlightenment meshed well with the settler colonial ideology of manifest destiny, which was then pushing the United States toward the Pacific coast. This stereotype of Native Americans as being frozen in the historical past was developed further by Romantic scholars after the Industrial Revolution. With their critical view of modernity in mind, these scholars adopted the distorted view of Native American life as being simple and timeless. They used the image to project their own nostalgia for a simpler pre industrial time. This is where the pejorative term noble savage comes from. Though this particular stereotype idealized Native Americans to some extent, like the previous examples, the stereotype said more about the European imagination than it did about Native American realities. Nevertheless, here again, Native Americans were depicted as being frozen in a pre modern past. Among other things, this obscured the fact that even if tribal nations were not industrial societies, their political existence was intrinsically tied to the modern industrial economy in the United States and in the world, which in many ways was fueled by the colonial dispossession of tribal lands and resources. Thus, by denying the coexistence of Native Americans in this shared historical time, Native American political realities were erased from world history. In the mid to late 1800s, the idea that Native Americans were frozen in time was developed further by another generation of anthropologists. These scholars conceived the idea of cultural evolutionism, which argued that Native American peoples represented an earlier stage in the evolution of world cultures, while European or white society represented the high point in this evolution. Attached to this idea was the belief that Native American cultures and societies were doomed to extinction. In this portrayal, the genocidal warfare that had decimated the indigenous populations of the United States was erased from the political history and depicted instead as an inevitable part of natural history. In the view of anthropology, then, if Native Americans were not yet part of the past, they soon would be. This scientific portrayal meshed conveniently with U.S. policymakers who were then legislating the forced removal of Native Americans onto reservations and the allotment of indigenous lands, and also the assimilation of Native Americans through the use of government boarding schools. The emerging academic field of American history followed suit and wrote Native Americans out of the history books. In their skewed nationalist histories, making a triumphant portrayal of the story of the United States. Once the U.S. nation state was established, Native Americans conveniently disappeared from the narrative. Despite these developments in Euro American culture, Native peoples living on reservations continued to fight for territorial sovereignty, while some chose to fight for political rights and cultural representation from within U.S. society. Hence, from the initial myth of discovery to more recent versions of American history, this ongoing strain of settler colonial ideology has not only worked to justify, rationalize, and legitimize U.S. colonial power in the West, it has also had a devastating impact on Native Americans who, as modern peoples, continue to live in the shadow of these distorted views and misrepresentations. The colonial myths have for a long time made Native Americans invisible to U.S. society. The myths have also made it hard for mainstream culture to see social, economic, and political issues that are impacting Native Americans. It is especially difficult for Native Americans themselves to navigate a society so saturated with stereotypes, many of which ignore their very existence. All that being said, it must be recognized that the diverse community of Native American peoples has been an important part of modern history in the US and beyond, experiencing cultural change as all peoples have. They have always resisted and challenged colonial myths and have made important contributions to modern culture. It is because of their struggle that Native American political issues have become more widely recognized today, and Native American voices have been able to shape public discourse on their own terms. This brings us to the second assigned reading for this week, which is Ariel Moniz's article, which is titled Being Native American in a Stereotypical and Appropriated North America. In her article, she begins by describing the psychology of stereotypes as a way to explain how Native Americans have been quote unquote othered in the minds of Euro Americans. The author goes on to describe how such stereotypes were reproduced in popular culture in the United States since the 1900s. Part of the author's argument is that US culture appropriated Native American culture. This means that Euro Americans adopted and transformed Native American culture into a stereotypical image that it could use to portray its own distorted vision of Native American life. The distorting legacy of this history, which is in line with the history I just described of settler colonial ideology, has made it incredibly difficult for non-Native peoples to see through the myths and to see Native Americans as modern peoples.